standing on the promises of God. It's obviously the path to a great life. And think about the hymn we just sang. Do you know what the most common biblical promise is? The promise that God most often gives to people? Well, the answer is, I will be with you. It's God's foremost promise always. Author John Ortberg, in his book, God is Closer Than You Think, writes, the central promise in the Bible is not, I will forgive you, although of course that promise is there. It is not the promise of life after death, although we are offered that one as well. The most frequent promise in the Bible is, I will be with you. Before Adam and Eve ever sinned or needed forgiveness, they were promised God's presence. God would walk with them in the cool of the day. The promise came to Enoch, who walked with God. It was made to Noah, to Abraham and Sarah, to Jacob and Joseph and Moses and David and Amos and Mary and Paul and too many others to list. It is the reason for courage. Do not be terrified, for the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go, the scripture says. It kept them going in darkness. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. God gave Israel the tabernacle and the ark of the covenant and manna and the temple and the pillar of cloud and another one of fire, like so many post-it notes saying, don't forget, I am with you. When God himself came to earth, his redemptive name was Emmanuel, God with us. When Jesus left, his final promise was to send the Spirit so that, as he said, I am with you always, even to the end of the age. The central promise in the Bible is, I will be with you. The constant message, God is closer than you think. It's one of the foremost things God wants us to get. A key component in experiencing the life abundant God hopes for us, that no matter where we find ourselves and how we got there and how things may appear, to know that God is there with us, sharing the experience, supporting us, reaching out to us, caring for us, helping us, loving us. Do you ever struggle to take hold of this central biblical promise? To really believe in it and live it and experience that God is actually right with you? Well, this is something of what I'd like to talk about this morning. Opening our lives to the living presence of God in our daily lives. Today we return to our study of the life of Moses, and we begin the second act of the drama. It's a key transitional part of the story in which Moses now actually begins his work of leading the people to freedom. The setup for which is as follows. Many years have passed since we last saw our hero. Specifically 40 years have passed. And a good way to remember the chronology of Moses' life is like this. Moses will live to be 120 years old. And his life can be divided into three 40-year periods. The first 40 years are spent growing up, living in the palace in Egypt. Then having killed a man and made a run for it. The second 40 years are spent hiding out, living the life of a shepherd in the land of Midian, which is the wilderness of the Sinai Peninsula. And the final 40 years then are to be spent leading the Israelites to the promised land. Now, we pick things up today at roughly the close of the second 40-year period. Moses is about 80 years old, and God comes to call him to return to Egypt and to lead the people of Israel out of captivity and into freedom. And as mentioned, this marks it's a pivotal moment in Moses' life. From a life going away from God, going wrong, hiding out, his will now turn into a life of tremendous accomplishment, of profound blessing, and most especially, of incredible nearness to God. This is the key. His will become a life so close to God, filled to overflowing with God's presence, walking with God daily. Basically, God breaks into his life in a powerful way. Moses discovers that God is closer than he thought, and it all begins with a burning bush. What do we learn here? That is, what does Moses discover in this moment? What does he experience? And how can we experience the same thing? More plainly stated, do you ever feel like God is missing from your life and you'd like to turn that around? Would you like to experience God present with you in a powerful way, have a close, real, living relationship with the Lord? Well, I'd like to offer a couple of suggestions to make this happen. From this famous story of Moses and the burning bush, 3 basic principles for experiencing the presence of the living God in your life today. Principle number 1, Be alert. As the scene opens, Moses is up in the mountains, busy tending his flock, when he suddenly notices this bush that is on fire, but it's not being burned up. Needless to say, it's a remarkable occurrence. It gets his attention, and that's the first point here, that God is there. God wants to have contact with Moses, to speak to him, to guide him, to call him, to be part of his life. But first, God has to get his attention, right? And it's the same with all of us. The burning bush is, first of all, simply an attention grabber. In effect, reminding us that God is always there, seeking to be part of our lives, to help us and to guide us. The question is, are we noticing? Are we paying attention to such things? Moments, incidences where God is trying to get our attention. Are we expecting such things and looking for them? Or more often, are we going through life oblivious to it all? You know, contrary to popular belief, God doesn't only speak to special people. God speaks to everyone, right? And God doesn't only speak to us occasionally, like rarely. No, God wishes to be in communication with us all the time. As it is written in the book of Psalms, the heavens are telling the glory of God, and the firmament proclaims his handiwork. Day to day pours forth speech, and night to night declares knowledge. There is no speech, nor are there words. Their voice is not heard, yet their voice goes out through all the earth, and their words to the end of the world. Day to day, it says, pours forth speech. There's continual communication from heaven. Their voice is not heard. That is, it isn't necessarily an audible sound, yet their voice, the voice of the heavens, goes out through all the earth. The words are there. God communicating constantly with those who have ears to hear. God is continually reaching out to us, speaking to us, seeking to guide and encourage and call and help us. And it all comes down to whether or not we're seeking this out from our side, you know? Are we open and receptive and expecting and seeking such things? People who have powerful experiences of God in their lives are, first of all, those who expect God to be reaching out to them and to speak to them every day, and who are thus alert to it. They're looking for it. They're constantly asking, how is God trying to get my attention today? You know? How is God reaching out to make contact with me today? Realizing that as with a burning bush, this contact is very likely to come in the most unusual way, or at least not necessarily in the way that we're expecting. It may be in a smile from a stranger, a call from a friend, the purr of a cat, the color of the sunset, a hug from a loved one, a word heard repeatedly, the laughter of a child. It may be in a familiar voice we've come to take for granted. It may be in a voice we least expect. But God reaching out to make contact, to talk to us. And how do you know if it's God's voice speaking and not another's? Well, as was with Moses here. Is the voice affirming you though you failed? Is it calling you into the lives of others in need? Is it asking the very best from within you? A voice of affirmation and love and grace and challenge and hope, not a voice of condemnation and separation and judgment and status quo and cynicism? This is the litmus test. You know? First thing, are we going through our lives alert to how God is trying to get our attention today, expecting the contact, you know? Or are we just going through life oblivious, unthinking, unnoticing, and then constantly wondering why God never seems to reach out to us, even though we call? You know, there's a story that's told of a man who was going through a very difficult time, and he longed to know that God was with him in his struggles. And so one very sad day, he sat down on a chair on his front porch and he began to pray. Lord, I need to know you're here. He said, please speak to me and tell me that there can still be joy. And with that, the man heard some laughter. He got up and he walked to the side of his house and he saw some children playing on his lawn. Well, he didn't like this. After all, he spent a lot of time taking care of his yard. Right? So he yelled at the children, "Get off my lawn!" And the children ran away in fear. The man went back to his chair and he continued his prayer. Lord, I need to know you are here. If you won't speak to me, then please reach out and touch me that I might feel your nearness. With that, a cool breeze suddenly arose on the very hot day and it brushed across the man's face. But all the man could think was, oh, great. I guess a storm is coming. The man returned to his prayer. Lord, I need to know that you are here. If you won't speak to me and you won't reach out and touch me, then please just show yourself to me. Let me see you somehow that I might know that you are here and caring for me in my hour of need. With that, a young couple across the street came out of their house and they started to walk toward their car. Seeing the man on the porch, they called out to him, Mr. Thompson, can we get you anything at the store? The man shouted back, some milk would be nice. And the couple replied, no problem, be back in a bit. And as they drove off, the man sat there looking all around. Well, where are you, God? Show yourself to me. Finally frustrated and seeing nothing, he went back into the house in despair. Burning bush principle number 1 in experiencing God's presence in your life, be alert. God's going to try to get your attention today. Count on it, right? Amen. Principle number 2, turn aside. Returning to the text, one of the little details that caught my attention was this. It says, Moses looked, and the bush was blazing, yet it was not consumed. Then Moses said, I must turn aside and look at this great sight and see why the bush is not burned up. When the Lord saw that he had turned aside to see, God called to him out of the bush, saying, Moses, Moses. Having observed the bush, Moses then made a conscious decision, it says, to turn aside, right? To stop what he's doing and to examine what's up. And it's only then that the text tells us that God actually spoke to him. And in other words, to experience God, Moses had to be willing to turn aside. That is, to stop what he was doing, to put his thoughts, his actions on hold for a moment in favor of what God was up to. Second great principle here. To experience God in our lives, we have to be willing to turn aside, to let go of our objectives, our schedule, our wants and desires in favor of what God is up to. But let's face it, this is often a very difficult thing to do. Simply put, most often we are so hung up on our schedules, our plans, our thoughts, our pain, our injuries, our issues, our objectives. We won't depart from any of all this, and thus we walk right by God. Right? Understand, holy ground is all around, right? God is calling constantly. The question is, will I put myself, my plans, my issues aside, and let my life be shaped instead by some surprising way that God is reaching out to me? Or will I rigidly stick to the course that I have set for myself and miss out on everything that God is bringing my way? How often are we missing out on God because we won't allow our will to be disrupted by God's will, right? What's the old saying? I used to be bothered by interruptions in my life until I realized that as a Christian, interruptions are my life. You see, for those who truly seek to experience God, interruptions are their life. It's the willingness to turn aside from where we are focused to see instead what God might be up to. How often are we resisting this? It's like, perhaps you remember the following really bad old joke. I've told this in the past, but it particularly fits here, so I'm going to use it again, okay? It goes like this. The story is told that many years ago, now former President George W. Bush had been invited to speak at a political rally, and following the rally, he was standing in the convention center lobby when he happened to notice a man in a long flowing white robe with a long flowing white beard and long flowing white hair. The man had a staff in one hand and some stone tablets under the other arm. George W., struck by the man's appearance, approached the man and asked, "Excuse me, but aren't you Moses?" The man ignored George W. and just stared at the ceiling. George W., unaccustomed to being ignored, tried again. "Excuse me, but aren't you Moses?" The man just continued staring at the ceiling. At this point, getting annoyed, George W. took hold of the man's arm and turning him around so that they faced one another, he asked him once again, "Excuse me, but aren't you Moses?" With this, the man finally responded in a very irritated voice, "Yes, I am, okay?" George W. said, why are you ignoring me?" To which Moses replied, "Well, it's like this. The last time I spoke to a bush, I spent 40 years wandering in the desert." Right? Let's face it, we generally don't want our lives interrupted, right? And it keeps us from the truly miraculous experience of God in our lives. Burning bush principle number 2, in experiencing God's presence in your life, turn aside. And then finally, principle number 3, go barefoot. Having gotten Moses' attention and Moses having turned aside, God then speaks to him out of the burning bush. And the first thing that God says to Moses is, stop, take off your sandals, for the ground on which you are standing is holy. Moses discovers that this mountaintop that he's undoubtedly been to many times before, and thought nothing of, this familiar location for feeding his flock, his workplace, if you will, is a sacred place. And God demands that he treat it as such, that he take off his shoes. It's a traditional sign in Eastern culture of respect and of reverence. And this is something of what God is commanding of Moses here, that he acknowledge the holiness of this very ordinary place. And in this, even better, that he connect to it. That is, think about this command to take off your sandals. Essentially, it's a command to go barefoot. Right? To go barefoot is to remove any barrier between you and the ground, to have nothing between your foot and the earth. It is to touch ground. It is to connect, right? And this, I believe, is God's final hope for Moses here, and for all of us in experiencing God's presence in our lives, that we connect. Think of it this way. Moses has spent the last 40 years of his life disconnecting from his people, from his problems, from his failings, from the world, from himself, distancing himself, hiding. It's the unwritten subtext of the whole previous chapter. Off in the wilderness of Midian, Moses has very much insulated himself from ever really having to feel and to touch and maybe even to hurt, but to live, really. God is now calling him back to connect, to feel, to touch, to maybe get hurt, but to at least finally be alive, right? To connect, specifically by opening himself to becoming involved in what God is doing. And this is what it finally means to take off your sandals, the call to go barefoot. So often we insulate ourselves. We try not to really feel. We try not to really get involved. We try not to connect. But the person who really wants to have God in their life is called to do the opposite, to not just pass by the moments of life, but instead to engage them and to see what we can offer to them, to get involved in what God is up to all around us. Now, there's great risk in this. It's like walking barefoot on the beach. You may feel the cool sand between your toes, or you may be cut by a shell, right? But the person who really wants to have God in their life, to be close to God, is called to feel and to touch, to not insulate themselves from life, but to connect to it. Specifically, to connect by being alert to and involved in what God is doing. Right? To look for that. As God in the burning bush had to get Moses' attention, to constantly ask ourselves, where is God trying to get my attention, and how does God want me to get involved in that today? Burning bush principle number 3, go barefoot. Connect to life. Engage the moments that God brings your way. In closing, I'd like to offer a personal illustration of this. Last summer, about a week or so after I had been diagnosed with leukemia, and a couple of weeks before my wife Tracy was scheduled to go in for her heart surgery, the surgery which, as most of you know, then began the whole ordeal of last fall. Tracy's multiple surgeries, weeks on life support, the stroke, all of which today, of course, she is making an absolutely amazing recovery from. In fact, today, this very day, we are blessed to be celebrating our 28th wedding anniversary. Praise the Lord. Well, a couple of weeks before all this, of last year's ordeal, as is normal procedure, Tracy was required to go to the hospital for a cardiac catheterization. They check if you have any blockages before you have heart surgery. And her appointment was set for the morning, and we got there early, but it ended up being one of those incredibly frustrating days of one delay after another. You're tense already, and they have all these delays. There were all sorts of emergencies going on at the hospital, so Tracy didn't get in for her procedure until late in the afternoon. Things went fine, but then there were more delays. It took hours to get her down to the recovery room, more hours before they would then clear her to leave. It was just such a long, anxious, annoying day. Tracy and I, we just wanted to go home. Please just let us leave. We're done, right? Finally, after everyone else in recovery had been cleared to leave, all the other 25 to 30 beds were now empty. Tracy was allowed to go, and it's dusk. The custodians are now going around cleaning up, restocking, all the stations. All the nurses are at the end of their shift, are standing at the very foot of Tracy's bed, and they're just sort of shooting the breeze. There's only one other patient in the room, and it's the bed right next to ours, and it's an older woman who had just been brought in about 10 minutes earlier having heart problems, and she has her family with her and a cardiologist. Her cardiologist is just showing up to check in. The head nurse now starts to prep Tracy to leave, and with that, right as I am looking at Tracy, I see the color just leave her face like a thermometer going cold, right? I look up at the monitor and her heart rate goes 70, 60, 50, 40, 30. The last time I look at her blood pressure, it's 40/20, right? Essentially, her heart is just shutting off. It's just shutting off as I'm watching, right? Alarms go off. Everybody leaps into action. We're losing her, They push me out of the way. They roll up, special emergency cart, with all the stuff on it. The cardiologist, who happened to be right next door, steps over and takes charge of what's going on. They're yelling at Tracy. They're injecting her with stuff, It seems like an eternity, but it's really only a couple of minutes, and they manage to get her heart back up and going again, and they stabilize her. Right? Now, at the time, we don't know that this is a precursor to everything that is ahead, how delicate her heart condition really is, and that this will be the first of 6 times over the next 2 months where we will almost lose her. And it's also the first of a series of miracles. Well, Tracy, having been stabilized, they now say she has to stay overnight for observation. Tracy still wants to go home, but I'm like, no, you're staying. You're staying. You're staying. It takes another couple of hours, it seems like, to get a room ready for her. It's more waiting, more frustration, more anxiety. And finally about 10 o'clock at night, 9:30, 10 o'clock at night, they get her to a room. It's now been about 12, 13 hours, and needless to say, it's been overflowing with stress, right? All the waiting, all the anxiety, almost losing her, and I am fried, right? I'm fried. I got nothing. Right? Tracy now settled into her bed, and she says, "Clark, go home. I'll be okay." "You sure?" "Yeah, go." Right? As I start to leave, however, Tracy then adds, "Could you please take my purse with you? I have my things in it. I don't want to leave it here." Right? Fine. I kiss her goodnight, pick up her purse, and I leave. I step out of the room, and you know how there are certain things in your life that you tend to pride yourself in, even though they don't really matter to anybody, but you pride yourself in. Well, one of the things I tend to pride myself in is a natural sense of direction. I can go anywhere, right? Particularly, I can go to a hospital and visit somebody, hospital I've never been to, make all sorts of twists and turns to get to them, and without even thinking, I'll find my way right back out. No mistakes. Right? Well, this particular night, this skill leaves me, right? I'm so burned out that as I step out of the room, I suddenly realize I have no idea where I am and how to get back to my car. And of course, as a guy, I'm not going to ask for directions. So I just start walking down the hall, and I come to the first intersection, and taking a guess, I turn right. But quickly I see that this is not the way out. Instead, what is right before me is this great big sign that reads, hematology and oncology, right? And I'm thinking, oh great, I can't escape this, right? Blood and cancer, it's the way I just spent my last week, I'm kind of lost in my thoughts, about my thoughts about all my problems and all Tracy's issues, and when a door in front of me opens up and out walks this woman, I guess her to be in her late 60s, maybe early 70s, very put together woman. Now remember, I'm standing there holding a purse, okay? This is a setup. Now I don't know this woman from anybody. I've never met her. But as she walks past me, out of the blue, she says, "Nice purse," right? In my head, my immediate thought is, oh, just what I need to finish off this day. Get lost, jerk, And normally, you see, as a native New Jerseyan, I would have had some sort of snotty comeback, right? But again, I'm so burned out. I'm lost. I'm so lost in my thoughts, I've got nothing. So without even turning to look at her, I just say, "Thank you." Translation, kiss my, right? I just keep staring at the oncology sign, motionless. After taking a few steps past me, however, the woman stops, and from behind me, I hear her say, "Can I help you?" With that, I turn around and look at her, and I say, "I'm just trying to get out of here. I can't remember where the elevator is." She says, "Let me show you." We take just a few steps the other way, and there's the elevator, right? As we get into the elevator, she asks me why I'm here so late, and I explain all that Tracy's just been through. And she assures me that this is a great hospital, Tracy's in good hands. And she knows this because she's been coming here for years. It seems her husband has lymphoma, has had it for 15 years, doing very well, but occasionally he has to come in for a little boost in his treatment. She knows all the best ways in and out of the building, so she can show me a quick route for tomorrow when I come back to get Tracy. Slowly, I'm starting to come out of my own thoughts, and I'm so thankful for her help. I say, "What's your husband's name?" She says, "Jack." And I'm thinking, that's going to be easy to remember because that's Tracy's dad's name. Right? I say, "Well, I'll make a point to lift up your husband in prayer that he can feel better and go home soon." She says, "You're a prayer?" It's like a really odd statement, weird turn of phrase, but basically she's saying, "You're a person who prays?" Right? And I say, "Yes, I believe very much in the power of prayer." She then looks at me with this odd expression that is sort of half, "I don't believe in that kind of nonsense," and the other half, "But I could sure use it," right? And she says, "Thank you, I'd appreciate that." We then get off the elevator. She shows me the quick way out of the building, and as one last little punchline to the whole thing, when we get to the parking lot, out of all the cars there, her car is parked right across from mine. And you know me, what I always think in those kind of moments, Lord, now you're just showing off, right? The point in all this, it's this. In my hour of need, as preparation for all that was soon to be ahead of me, like Moses centuries ago, God let me know that he is here with me and would bring me through, providing whatever is needed. Guide me, help me, reassure me. It's a moment that I return to many times over the months ahead when my faith started to falter a little bit, you know? And how did I come to realize God's living presence? Well, notice exactly how it played out. First, God had to get my attention. Now, Moses, he was lucky. He got a burning bush. But that wouldn't work with me. You show me a burning bush, I'm calling the fire department. What works with Clark Callender? Well, as all as you know, I have a very sarcastic sense of humor, right? So what did God use? Sarcasm. Nice purse, right? God knows what works with each of us, right? An attention grabber. But to be grabbed, I then had to turn aside to engage it. Look away from my issues for a moment and focus on the person that God had brought my way as the living embodiment of his presence and his grace. And then finally, what brought all this to fulfillment, all the pieces coming together in a clear and obvious God sighting, too many coincidences to be a coincidence. In thankfulness, I let go of myself to give something back to the moment, to connect to it. I'll lift up your husband in prayer. Okay? Gave back. And with that, God showed up for everybody concerned. Poet Elizabeth Barrett Browning once wrote, "Earth's crammed with heaven, and every common bush afire with God. But only he who sees takes off his shoes. The rest sit around it and pluck blackberries." Like Moses many years ago, let the presence of the living God break through into your life this week. Be alert, turn aside, and go barefoot. God is closer than you think. Let us join together in singing our closing hymn, number 310, in the red hymnal, He Lives. Would you please stand?